Hello and welcome to our computer side chat on elections in the United States. We're going to be talking about how elections are run here and the different types of elections in the United States. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. Alright, so let's start with a simple question. What is an election? An election is the process by which citizens of a country vote someone into an elected office. So that elected office might be the presidency, it might be a U.S. senator, it might be a U.S. House representative. Election is the process in which we choose people to fill those offices, and we vote those people in. So, what are the requirements for voting, specifically in the state of Ohio? First off, you must be 18 years old. That is the minimum age for voting. Citizenship-wise, there are two parts to that. Number one, you must be a U.S. citizen. Number two, you must have lived in Ohio at an Ohio address for the past 30 days. So in other words, you have to have lived in this state for 30 days before you can vote in an election here. Lastly, you also need to register. You are required to register 30 days or more before the election. To register, you also need things like an ID, basically prove who you are, and you need to bring that ID with you when you vote at the polls. So those are the simple requirements for voting in Ohio. Alright, so what types of elections do we have here? Elections can be boiled down into three main types. The most popular and the most scrutinized are obviously presidential elections. These happen every 4 years, as presidential terms are 4 years. The second type of election is a congressional election. These take place every 2 years, and they focus on electing U.S. senators or U.S. House representatives. In other words, electing new congressmen and women. Because these happen every 2 years, halfway into the presidential cycle, we get what is called a midterm election. So 2 years into a president's 4-year term, the midterm elections roll around where we re-elect or elect new senators and House representatives. This election is generally a reflection of how that president's term in office is going. Generally, if the president is doing poorly, his party will do poorly in the midterm elections. If people are happy with the president, his party will do well in the midterm elections. So we use the midterms as kind of a gauge for what does the public think of the president's job so far. Lastly, we have state and local elections. These are elections where we vote for state and local representatives such as governor of the state or state representatives, and where we also vote for legal issues. So, a recent issue on the ballot in 2015 was marijuana legalization in the state of Ohio. That's something that might be on a state or local election. Now, these take place in November and they can overlap. So you can find yourself in November voting for the president, a handful of congressmen in your state, and a handful of local elections as well. So these elections tend to overlap. They take place at the same time. Before we move forward, I'd like to take a look at this graph here on the right. Now, as you can see by the title, this has to do with a voter turnout from 1940 to 2014. The blue line represents turnout to presidential elections. The orange line represents voter turnout to midterm elections or non-presidential elections. So as you can see with the blue line, the last presidential election we had was in 2012. There was a 58% voter turnout in 2012 to elect the new president, or to re-elect Barack Obama, I should say. Now compare that to the orange line, which shows in 2014, the most recent midterm election, voter turnout was 36.4%. So you can see that voters tend to get out far more when the president is on the ballot. That's despite the fact that those midterm elections focus on our legislative branch, which is the branch that has the most power and makes the most impact on the laws of our country and where our country will go from year to year. So if you really want to impact the country in the direction it's going, vote in midterms. Vote on your congressional candidates. That's the most important thing to do. So let's move forward. Now, elections are done in two steps. It's worth mentioning at this point that while these steps often pertain to state and local representatives, what we're going over is going to focus more on federal level elections. So that would be for the U.S. president and for U.S. congressmen. So what are those two steps? Well, the first step in any election cycle is what is known as the primary or caucus elections, often referred to as primary season. And these are the elections that are carried out by our two major political parties, the Republicans and Democrats, in each state. And the point of these primaries and caucuses is to choose their nominee for the upcoming election. So these are kind of the elections before the elections. This is how the Republican Party and Democratic Party decide who they're going to have run for president or for U.S. Senator in the state of Ohio or as House Representative for a specific district. These primary and caucuses are used to figure out who should the nominee be. And a nominee is simply a political party's candidate for elected office. After we've had the primary and caucus elections and we've decided who our nominee is going to be as a party, we move forward to the general election. So in November, when we actually go to the polls to vote to see who takes an office, that is known as a general election. So that is an election where the citizens of a state choose who they want to fill an elected office. And again, elected offices can refer to the president, a senator, a House representative, so on and so forth. So those are the two steps that an election is broken down into, the primary season and the general election. Let's break that down even further and look at how we select the nominees as a political party. So let's go through this step by step. This is how the process would look. So the first thing that has to happen is candidates declare their intent to run for office. So as you can see on the left here, leading up to the 2016 election, there were multiple people vying for the Democratic and Republican nominations. Bernie Sanders was one of the main Democratic rivals to Hillary Clinton. Ted Cruz was one of the main Republican rivals to Donald Trump. And as you can see down in the corner, Donald Trump, the headline of him announcing his push for the presidency and ending up being the surprise nominee for the Republican Party. So that's the first step, is you have to declare that you are running for office. So where do we go from there? Well, that generally takes place 2 years or a year and a half, maybe a year if you're cutting it close, before an actual general election. So if the election in 2016 took place in November, that means people started declaring their intent to run for the presidency generally around January of 2015, summer of 2015. Somewhere in that area is where these candidates started to announce their candidacy. So from there, these candidates will go do a whole bunch of speaking events, do a whole bunch of rallies. There's also a bunch of debates between the candidates within a party as they try to make their case for why they should be the Republican nominee or the Democratic nominee. The next major event we'll get to are the party primary and caucuses. I already mentioned these in the previous slide. Let's get into those in a little bit more depth. So what are they? I kind of already said this, but let's review it again. These are the 6 months worth of state elections where citizens will vote on who they want to be the nominee for their respective party. So if I'm a Democrat, I will go to my state's primary, whenever that is, and primaries take place between January and June, and I will go vote for the person that I feel I want running as the nominee for my party for, say, president. So if I'm a Republican, and back in January of 2016, I believe that Ted Cruz was best fit to run as the candidate for my party, then when I went to my primary or to my caucus, I would vote for Ted Cruz and say, hey, this is who I want to run for the Republican nominee as president. Who decides how they're conducted? The states do. If you remember back to federalism, and we talked about powers that are reserved for the states or delegated to the federal government, the power to conduct elections and run elections are reserved for the states. So this pertains to both general elections as well as these primaries and caucuses. The state governments are in charge of running them, and coming up with the rules and standards for these elections. So let's take a look at the way these primaries and caucuses are run. Like we just said, the states are the ones in charge of these. You have 50 different states, so that means you have 50 different types of primaries or caucuses. So really quickly, we want to go over what these can look like. So when we talk about a primary or we talk about a caucus, these are both different types of nominating elections. So your state either has a primary election or it has a caucus election. Let's first talk about primary elections because those are the most popular. So a primary election is an individual citizen voting privately in a voting booth for the candidate that he or she wants to be their party's nominee. So again, let's go back. Let's say I am a Republican, and again, let's say I'm supporting Ted Cruz. If I'm in a state that uses a primary, which here in Ohio we use a primary system, I will go to my polling precinct. I will walk into a voting booth. I will declare that whether I am a Republican or a Democrat. In this scenario, again, declaring that I am a Republican. And then I will pick who I want to run as the nominee for the Republican Party. So that's how things would work in a primary election. It's private. No one knows who I voted for as long as I don't tell them. So that is the basis for what a primary election is. That said, there are different ways that you can run your primary. There are a lot of different ways depending on which state you're in. That said, we're only going to focus on two of them. Closed primaries and open primaries. So let's first talk about a closed primary. A closed primary is a situation where only registered members of a political party can vote in that party's primary. So for me to be able to go during the Republican primaries in Ohio, to be able to go and vote for who I want to be the presidential nominee, I have to be registered in the Republican Party. If I am registered as an independent or if I am just not registered with a political party at all, I can't vote in the primary. That is called a closed primary. I have to declare which party I'm with if I want to vote in their primary. An open primary is the opposite. I do not need to declare a party affiliation to vote. So, if I'm an independent, I can choose whether I want to vote in the Democratic primary or in the Republican primary. If I am a Republican, but I actually like one of the Democratic candidates better, I can choose to actually vote in the Democratic primary and vote for my candidate that I believe in the most in their party. So that's the difference between closed and open. A closed primary, you have to be registered to that party to be able to vote in their primary. An open primary means you don't have to be registered in any party. You can vote for whoever you want in those primaries and vote for whichever party you want. When it comes to these primaries, most of them are decided by what's called a plurality. This will also hold true when we talk about caucuses here in a second. So, a plurality means having the most votes. It does not necessarily mean getting the majority. So, for example, let's say in my primary, I'm running to be the Democratic nominee, and I'm running against two other people. So there's three of us in total. Let's say we split the vote 35, 30, 30, and then the other 5% just wrote someone in or submitted an empty ballot. I got 35%, so I got the most votes in that primary. I didn't get the majority, though. Only 35% of the voters voted for me. But in a primary and caucus system, that doesn't matter. I still had the most votes, or I had the plurality. So I win that primary. So that's how most of these primaries and caucuses are decided, because so many people are running to be the nominee that no one candidate is going to get a majority vote. They're going to just have to get the plurality, generally somewhere in the 30 to 40% range of the vote. So those are primaries. The other type of nominating election, or the other type of election we can use to choose a nominee, is through something called a caucus. Now, these are really rare. They're not used much anymore. The majority of states use a primary, either open or closed. However, some states still hold to the caucus way of choosing their nominees or throwing their support behind a specific nominee. Probably most importantly, Iowa uses a caucus. Iowa is the first nominating election that takes place during primary season in January. So it gives us our first idea of who are the favored nominees for each party. So what is a caucus? A caucus is a closed meeting where citizens meet and openly declare their vote for which candidate they support to be their party's nominee. So like I said, in the primary, you would actually go to a voting booth and you would vote privately. At a caucus, I would decide whether I want to go to the Democratic caucus or the Republican caucus. I would go to whichever one I chose, and it would be in a big, big meeting room. And then I would decide, okay, I want to support this candidate. So I would go caucus with that candidate. What that means is myself and all the other people that support that candidate would go stand wherever in the room they designated that, hey, supporters of this person go here. And so basically you're openly declaring at these meetings who you're supporting. They count up the people in each group. Whoever has the most people wins that caucus. So it's essentially where a primary is a private vote, a caucus is an open or public vote. So that's the major difference between these two. Caucuses are useful and kind of cool in the sense that while you have one side for, say, going back to Democratic primaries, when it came down to just being Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Well, one side of the room you would have for Bernie Sanders, one side you would have for Clinton, and then all the undecideds could meet in the middle. And then the Sanders camp and the Clinton camp could send over representatives to try to convince these undecided voters to come support them. So the downfall of it is that you're publicly declaring your vote. People know who you're supporting, maybe even if you don't want them to. But it also leads to a lot of open dialogue. It allows people who maybe are undecided to hear both sides, or multiple sides if there's a lot of people competing for the nomination. So it leads to a good dialogue. It's a chance for people to get information. So that's the difference, again, between a primary and a caucus. And again, the entire point of these primaries and caucuses is from January to June, each state declares who they support. So when Ohio had its primary, we had a Democratic primary and a Republican primary. We ended up supporting Hillary Clinton to be the Democratic nominee, and we ended up supporting John Kasich, who is our governor, to be the Republican nominee. So that is who our state threw its support behind for each nomination. So, how are the winners decided, more specifically? Well, each state has a designated number of delegates. Now, what is a delegate? These are just individuals chosen to represent their state for each of the two parties. So each state has a designated number of delegates. The Republican Party just chooses who they want to be the delegates in that state. The Democratic Party chooses who they want to be their delegates in that state. And so similar to how the president is elected by way of electoral votes, each party decides who their nominee is based on delegates. Now, how are these delegates split up? Again, this is decided by the states, and you can do it in one of two ways. The first way could be winner take all, and we see that with this graph here at the bottom. So, in this winner take all scenario, there's 10 delegates available. Let's say candidate A gets 40% of the vote and candidate B gets 60%. Candidate B won. In a winner take all scenario, candidate B gets all 10 delegates. All 10 delegates from the state will throw their support behind candidate B. Candidate A, despite 40% of that state's population voting for them, will not get any delegates from that election. The second way is proportional representation. So that's up here on the left. And again, if we put ourselves in the same scenario, candidate A gets 40% of the vote, candidate B gets 60%. It's proportional. So candidate A would get 4 of those 10 delegates. Because again, they got 40% of the vote. Candidate B would get 6 of the 10 delegates because they got 60%. So that is how these elections are decided. Excuse me. When Clinton won the primary here in Ohio, she had a certain number of delegates throw support behind her. Now, if you can see down here in the very bottom left-hand corner, this shows at one point the back and forth between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders to obtain enough delegates to win the nomination for the Democratic Party. So if you can see here under delegate results, 2,383 were needed for the nomination. At this point, Clinton was sitting at 2,305, pretty much wrapping up the election. Sanders pretty well behind her. So it's a race to get the majority of delegates from all 50 states to give to decide whether or not you will be the nominee for your party. Hopefully that makes sense. Basically, the better you perform in a state, the more votes you get, the more delegates throw their support behind you, the more delegates throw their support behind you, the more likely it is you will become your party's nominee for president. So, we go through January through June. We go through all 50 states, run their primaries and caucuses. They've all voted, and they have made their voice heard for who they think should be the nominee from each party. With this election in 2016, the decision of the 50 states was for the Democratic Party. Hillary Clinton got the majority of votes in all the primaries and caucuses, and Donald Trump got the majority of votes on the Republican side. So, what happens then is we proceed to what are called the national conventions, and these take place in July of the election year. So, what are these? Well, the national conventions are a party-run event where the Democrats or Republicans officially announce their party ticket for president and vice president. They also lay out their party goals and ambition for the next 4 years. So these are only used in the case of the president and vice president. The national conventions generally don't have anything to do with senators and House representatives who won their primaries or caucuses. They don't get a convention. This is really only for the president and vice president to be officially named as their party's nominees. So again, these took place, the most recent ones in July of 2016. The Republican convention is called the Republican National Convention, or the RNC, and as you can see in 2016 it took place in Cleveland. And the Democratic convention is called the Democratic National Convention, also known as the DNC. The longer title of that would be the DNCC. So these generally take place 2 weeks apart from each other. They're generally a week long. And again, it's a chance for the parties to officially lay out what their plan is for the next 4 years, and they officially name who their nominee is going to be for both president and vice president. It is also a chance for those nominees to officially accept that nomination. So really it's just a big party, a big celebration where the parties get to say, hey, here's who we're running for president this November. Get behind them and vote for them. I used the term earlier, party ticket. All a party ticket is the name for the party's nominees for president and vice president. So when you hear someone say the Democratic ticket, in 2016, the Democratic ticket would be Clinton-Kaine. Hillary Clinton being the presidential nominee, Tim Kaine being the vice presidential nominee. For the Republicans, the Republican ticket would be Trump-Pence. Donald Trump being the presidential candidate, Mike Pence being the vice presidential candidate. So those are the national conventions. It's the July before the election, and the parties officially announce who they will be running for president. So that was just the nomination process. As you can tell, it's kind of confusing and long-winded. Like I said, the process to find a nominee for president for each party generally starts about a year and a half before the presidential election. It's a really drawn-out, arduous process that can be very difficult to follow and very confusing. Hopefully my explanation made sense. We will be going over it more in class. Now, let's get to the general election. And as you remember, the general election is where we actually vote for these people to actually take that office. Now, it's done a little bit differently for congressmen versus the president. So let's first talk about how we elect a congressman or woman here in Ohio. And again, that also differs between voting for a House representative and a U.S. senator. So let's start with the U.S. House of Representatives. So in the U.S. House of Representatives, a House rep is elected by a majority of citizens in their congressional district. This map over here on the right is a map of the congressional districts in the state of Ohio. There are 16 congressional districts, which means we have 16 representatives in the House. If you can see, Union County, where Marysville is located, is in congressional district number 4. So, when people from Marysville go to the polls, when their House rep is up for re-election, they will only be voting for the congressional representative in district number 4. They won't be voting for the other 15. You only vote for the one in the district where you are present. So, House Congressional District number 4's current holder is a guy named Jim Jordan. He is a Republican. So that is the guy that is currently holding that House rep position. So only certain parts of the state will vote for certain House members. The entire state does not vote on all 16. That's important to remember. You only vote for one House rep, and it's dependent on where you live. The other chamber of Congress, being the Senate, is a little different. So, U.S. senators are elected by the majority of citizens in their entire state. So it's not just divided up where you vote based on your district. In the state of Ohio, everybody is voting for the same senators. And every single state, because again, the Senate is equal representation, every single state has 2 senators. Our 2 senators right now are Rob Portman, a Republican, and Sherrod Brown, a Democrat. Fun side fact, my mom actually worked as an aide for Sherrod Brown when he worked in the state legislature here in Ohio. So a little bit of a family connection there for me. So that wraps up how we elect congressmen. And as you can see, it's done with a simple majority. Whether that's the majority of the whole state, as is the case with the senators, or of the majority of a congressional district, as is the case with U.S. House representatives. Let's move forward to how do we elect a president, because this is the one that's really confusing. So how does the presidential election work? Well, the winner of the presidential election is the individual who receives the majority of electoral votes from the Electoral College, the majority being 270 votes or more. So if that's the case, we need to be able to understand that statement, we need to understand what the Electoral College is. The Electoral College is a group of 538 voters from all 50 states and Washington, D.C. They are the ones that cast the official votes for president and vice president. These 538 voters are known as electors, electors. Who are these people? Well, they can be anybody. There's no formal qualification to be an elector. Generally, you just have to know somebody. So if you're connected to some way to someone higher up in the state government or someone high up in one of the parties, generally that is the way that you become an elector. So if it's these electors who vote for the president and cast the actual ballot, what are we voting for in November when we go to vote? Well, you are actually voting for the electors who have pledged to vote for a specific candidate. So those electors can then go vote for the president and vice president. So when you go to vote, when you go to the polling precinct and you go into your booth, you'll see it'll actually say, who do you want to vote for president? Do you want to vote Clinton, Kane, or do you want to vote Trump, Pence? You're not actually voting for them directly. You're voting for, in the case of Ohio, the 18 electors that have pledged to vote for Trump or the 18 electors that have pledged to vote for Clinton. That's how the system works. So we're voting for people that will then vote for the president. Before we move forward, I just kind of wanted to show the electoral map. So there are 538 total electoral votes. Like I said, you need 270 or more to win, as that is a majority. So you can see all these numbers are kind of different, some bigger than others. Here in the state of Ohio, we have 18 votes, 18 electoral votes. We are kind of a big deal. 18 is quite a few. We are also something known as a swing state. What that means is we don't tend to vote one way or the other. Any party can win the state of Ohio. Republicans have won it, Democrats have won it, and it is very, very likely whoever the state of Ohio votes with will end up being the President of the United States. So how are the number of electoral votes for each state decided? And this picture here on the right shows how it's decided here in Ohio. It's a really simple math equation, and it is the number of U.S. House representatives from your state plus the number of U.S. senators from your state. You put those two numbers together, and that is how many electoral votes you get. So, as we discussed earlier, the state of Ohio has 16 House representatives. We also have, like every other state, 2 senators. You put those two numbers together, and there you have Ohio's 18 electoral votes. So that is how your electoral vote number is decided. Now, let's close out by talking about the popular vote versus the electoral vote. So like I said, the electoral votes are the things that count. It's those 538 things that matters. If you get 270 electoral votes or more, you win the presidency. So what do we mean when we say popular vote? Well, the popular vote is who the majority of the nation as a whole voted for. So, if the majority of people in 2012 voted for Barack Obama, that means Barack Obama had the popular vote. He also had the most electoral votes. So Barack Obama in 2012 and in 2008 won the presidency with the popular vote and the electoral vote. Now, what impact does popular vote have on presidential elections? None. It really doesn't. Now, obviously, from a state-to-state basis, it has an effect. If more people in the state of Ohio vote for Clinton than for Trump, then the Clinton electors win, and Ohio will go for Clinton. But when we talk about the nation as a whole, which is what the popular vote covers, it doesn't really matter. In fact, you can win the popular vote. In other words, more people across the country can vote for you, and you can still lose, assuming your opponent won the correct states. That has happened 4 times. The most recent being in 2000 between Al Gore and George W. Bush. So if you see these two pictures here at the bottom, on the left we have the popular vote. And as you can see, Al Gore has the edge in the popular vote. It's a very slim edge, but more people voted for Al Gore than they did George W. Bush. If we look on the right, though, because George Bush won really big important states like, say, Ohio and Florida, he had more electoral votes by a very slim margin. That means George W. Bush wins the presidency. That has often been a criticism of the Electoral College, and something people point to as a reason why, hey, maybe this system isn't totally working. So that is going to wrap it up for us for presidential elections. So when you come to class tomorrow, we will be talking a little bit more about this. I know this was really confusing. American elections are a really long, confusing process. So we're going to try to make a little bit more sense of it, break it down, and have this become a little bit more understandable. From there, we'll also take a look at what a ballots look like. So when you go to your voting precinct after you turn 18 and you go to the polls, what is actually going to be in front of your face and how do you vote? That's what we're going to cover next. Have a great night. If you have any questions, let me know. Don't forget to go to Schoology and take part 1 and 2 of the quizzes, and I will see you in class.